The seal on junction 49 was weeping. Not dripping, not spraying. Weeping, a slow, steady bead of condensation forming along the bottom curve of a pressure coupling that connected the main water trunk to the portside feeder array of orbital platform Vaelith Directorate. The bead would swell, tremble, and fall into a catch basin that had been placed beneath it sometime in the last decade by someone whose name nobody remembered. The basin was half full. Nobody had emptied it in weeks. Corin Halloway knew this because he emptied it himself every third shift. He was on his knees beneath the junction, using a hand drag to wipe down the coupling housing, when the first announcement came through the station-wide channel. The voice belonged to Director Shale, a tall, angular Vaelith woman who ran the platform's administrative apparatus with the precise detachment of someone who had never once touched a pipe wrench. Her tone was cool, efficient, and faintly rehearsed. All section heads and senior engineering staff will report to the Central Operations Theater at 0800 for the commencement of the triennial infrastructure review. Directorate Inspector Kelvor Sahune will be conducting a full-spectrum assessment of the platform's critical systems. All maintenance schedules are to be brought current. All deviation reports are to be filed by end of shift today. This is not optional. Corin continued wiping the coupling. He had been a plumber on Vaelith Directorate for 9 years. Not a maintenance engineer, not a systems technician, not a hydraulic specialist, though he could do all of those jobs, and had done all of those jobs at various points when nobody else was available. His official title on the station's labor manifest was Contracted Water Systems Maintenance, Human, Non-Credentialed. That last word was the one that mattered. It meant he had never attended a Vaelith Engineering Academy. It meant his certifications were Terran, not Directorate. It meant that in the eyes of every ranked officer on the platform, he was a pair of hands that unclogged drains and tightened fittings, and that was the full extent of his professional identity. He was 53 years old. He had calluses on his palms thick enough to grip a hot pipe without flinching. He carried a hand-forged pipe wrench everywhere he went, a heavy, ugly thing made from scrap alloy on a Terran colony world 26 years ago, with his initials punched into the handle by a friend who was now dead. The wrench had no digital readout, no micro-torque calibration, no haptic feedback system. It was a lever and a jaw and a handle, and it had never failed him. The thing about plumbing, Corin had learned, was that nobody thought about it until it stopped working, and when it stopped working, nobody wanted to think about why. They wanted it fixed. They wanted it fixed quietly, quickly, and by someone who would not make them feel stupid for not understanding how the water got from the reservoir to their shower head. That was the job, not the pipes, not the fittings, not the pressure differentials. The job was being invisible enough that the people who relied on you never had to acknowledge that you existed. Corin was very good at this job. He finished wiping the coupling, checked the catch basin level 3/4 now. The weep was getting worse, and pulled himself up from the crawlspace. The corridor around him was quiet. Third shift on the lower decks was always quiet. The hum of the station's gravity generators, the distant thrum of the water trunk's main pump, the occasional click of an automated valve cycling somewhere in the walls. He liked it. 9 years of this, and he still liked the quiet. He did not like inspections. The triennial infrastructure review was a Vaelith Directorate tradition. Every 3 standard years, a certified inspector from the Bureau of Structural Integrity would visit each orbital platform, review its engineering records, walk through its critical systems, and issue a compliance rating. A passing rating meant continued operation. A failing rating meant immediate remediation, which, in practice, meant the station's director took the blame. The engineering staff scrambled to patch whatever had been flagged, and the workers who actually maintained the systems were expected to fix everything while somehow not being seen fixing anything. Inspector Kelvor Sahune arrived at 0730 in a diplomatic shuttle that docked at the station's VIP berth on the upper ring. Corin saw the shuttle through a viewport while he was replacing a pressure regulator in one of the officers' washrooms on Deck 3. The shuttle was sleek, white, and polished to a mirror finish. He looked at his own reflection in the viewport gray coveralls, pipe wrench in his belt loop, a smear of sealant compound across his left forearm, and went back to work. By the time the inspection formally began, the entire senior engineering staff had assembled in the Central Operations Theater. Corin was not invited. He was not senior. He was not engineering staff. He was a plumber. But the station's internal communication channel was open, and Risha, one of the junior Vaelith technicians who had, over the years, learned to treat him like a colleague rather than furniture, had quietly patched him into the feed. He listened from Deck 11, sitting on an overturned maintenance crate in a utility closet, eating a cold sandwich. Inspector Sahune's voice was smooth, precise, and carried the particular authority of someone who had the power to shut a station down with a single report. He began with the atmospheric processing array. The senior atmosphere engineer, a Vaelith named Toval Rek, presented the system's metrics: filtration rates, CO2 scrubbing efficiency, particulate counts, backup system redundancy. Sahune asked questions. Toval answered them. The metrics were clean. Then structural integrity. The senior structural engineer presented hull stress readings, thermal expansion coefficients, microfracture scans. Clean. Then power generation. The senior power engineer presented fusion core output, harmonic stability, failover protocols. Clean. Then Sahune said, water systems. There was a pause on the channel. Corin stopped chewing. The senior water systems engineer was a Vaelith named Dreshen. Dreshen held a Directorate Master's credential in hydraulic engineering, had published 14 papers on closed-loop fluid dynamics in orbital environments, and had been stationed on Vaelith Co. for 6 years. He had designed the platform's tertiary water recycling loop. He had 3 junior engineers under him, and access to every diagnostic tool the Directorate manufactured. He had never, to Corin's knowledge, crawled inside a pipe. Water Systems Report, Dreshen began, and Corin could hear the confidence in his voice, the tone of a man who had checked his numbers, polished his presentation, and believed that the truth lived in the data. Main reservoir at 94% capacity. Primary distribution pressure stable at 2.8 standard atmospheres. Recycling efficiency at 97.3%. Secondary loop operational. Tertiary loop operational. All automated monitoring systems, reporting nominal across all sectors. Deviation reports, Sahune asked. None filed in the current review period. Maintenance exceptions. None. All scheduled maintenance completed on time per the standard calendar. Corin set his sandwich down. None filed. None. He had filed 11 deviation reports in the last 8 months alone. Weeping seals, corroded junction housings, a hairline fracture in a secondary feeder pipe on Deck 7 that he had found by listening, literally pressing his ear to the wall and listening for the change in pitch that meant the metal was fatigued. He had welded a reinforcement sleeve over it himself, filed the report through the standard maintenance channel, and tagged it Priority 2. He had never received a response. Not once, not to any of them. 11 reports, all submitted through the proper system, all time-stamped, all tagged. And Dreshen, standing in the Central Operations Theater in front of the Directorate inspector, had just told the man that no deviations existed. Corin sat in the utility closet and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter than anger. The particular feeling of a man who does his job correctly and watches someone else pretend that his job does not exist. He picked up his wrench and went back to work. The inspection failure happened on the second day. Sahune had moved from the theater to a walking tour of the platform's physical infrastructure. This was the part of the inspection that senior engineers dreaded, not the numbers review, which could be prepared and presented, but the physical walkthrough, where the inspector looked at actual hardware and asked questions about things that were not in the presentation. Corin learned what happened from Risha, who was assigned to shadow the inspection tour as a junior observer. Sahune had begun with the Atmospheric Processing Center on Deck 2, clean, then the Fusion Core Observation Room on Deck 5, clean, then the Water Treatment Facility on Deck 8. The Water Treatment Facility was a cathedral-sized chamber at the center of the station's engineering ring. 6 massive filtration columns rose from the floor to the ceiling, each one cycling thousands of liters of reclaimed water through a series of biological, chemical, and mechanical purification stages. The facility was automated, monitored by an array of sensors that fed data to the engineering team's dashboards in real time. It was Dreschen Vuo's pride. He had optimized its efficiency ratings to a decimal place. Sahune walked the facility floor. He examined the filtration columns. He checked the sensor readouts against the maintenance logs, and then he stopped at the base of column 4 and looked down. There was a puddle. Not a large puddle, a puddle roughly the size of a dinner plate, sitting in a shallow depression in the deck plating at the base of the column. The water was clear. It smelled faintly of the mineral treatment used in the recycling process. It should not have been there. "What is this?" Sahune asked. Dreschen Vuo looked at the puddle. Then he looked at his datapad. Then he looked at the puddle again. "A minor condensation artifact," he said. "The temperature differential between the column interior and the ambient deck temperature can produce surface moisture on the housing." Sahune crouched. He touched the puddle with one long, pale Vaelith finger. He rubbed the water between his fingertip and his thumb. Then he looked up at Dreschen with an expression that Risha later described to Corin as the look of a man who has just been lied to and knows exactly how much the lie will cost. "This is not condensation," Sahune said. "This is treated system water. There is a leak in this column. Where is your deviation report?" Dreschen's face went still. "There is no deviation report. The automated monitoring system has not flagged." "The automated monitoring system," Sahune said, straightening, "measures flow rate and pressure at the inlet and outlet. It does not measure housing integrity. A slow leak at the column base would not trigger a flow rate alarm because the volume loss is below the threshold, but it would, over time, indicate a seal failure in the housing foundation, which, if left unaddressed, could compromise the column's biological filtration layer." He paused. "This is a Category 2 infrastructure deficiency. Has your maintenance staff physically inspected these columns in the current review period?" Dreschen said nothing. Sahune wrote something on his datapad. The sound of the stylus was very loud in the quiet of the treatment facility. "I am flagging the Water Systems Division for comprehensive reevaluation," he said. "All water infrastructure on this platform will be physically inspected before I leave. Not sensor data, physical inspection. Every pipe, every junction, every seal, every coupling. If your engineering team cannot complete this within 72 hours, I will issue a provisional failure rating, and this station will be placed on remediation status." He turned and walked out of the treatment facility. Dreschen Vuo stood beside column 4 with his datapad in his hand and said nothing at all. The senior engineering team convened an emergency session within the hour. Corin was not invited. He learned about it from the maintenance channel, which erupted with priority directives approximately 40 minutes after the session began. The directives were frantic. Every junction in the water distribution network was to be physically inspected and its condition logged. Every seal was to be tested. Every coupling was to be pressure checked. Every filtration column base was to be examined for housing integrity. The work was to begin immediately and was to be completed within the 72-hour window. Vaelith's water distribution network comprised approximately 14,000 individual junction points, 800 pressure couplings, 260 seal assemblies, and 6 filtration column bases. The senior engineering team consisted of Dreschen and 3 junior engineers. The maintenance staff consisted of 11 Vaelith technicians and 4 contracted human workers. Corin did the math. 14,000 junctions, 15 workers, 72 hours. That was roughly 933 junctions per worker, or about 13 per hour, with no breaks, no sleep, and no time spent on the actual repairs that the inspections would inevitably reveal. It could not be done. It especially could not be done by a team whose senior engineers had never crawled inside the infrastructure they were supposed to be inspecting. The first cascade failure happened at hour 6. Dreschen's junior engineers working from the automated system maps had begun their inspections at the top of the network, the main reservoir, and the primary distribution trunk on Deck 2. They were thorough, methodical, and slow. They had digital calipers. They had ultrasonic thickness gauges. They had portable pressure testing rigs that required calibration between each reading. They were doing the job the way they had been trained to do it, by the book, by the numbers, with full documentation at every step. They were averaging 4 junctions per hour. At that rate, the 72-hour window would cover approximately 43% of the network. Meanwhile, the Vaelith technicians had been dispatched to the mid-level distribution grid, decks 5 through 9, and were running into problems that their training had not prepared them for. The mid-level grid was old. Portions of it predated the current station configuration. Pipe runs that appeared on the system maps did not match the physical layout. Junctions that were supposed to be accessible were behind sealed bulkheads. Valve assemblies that were listed as automated had been manually bypassed at some point in the past by someone who had left no documentation. The technicians were spending more time trying to find the junctions than inspecting them. At hour 6, a technician named Sorval attempted to access a pressure coupling on Deck 7 by removing a maintenance panel that had been welded to the bulkhead from the inside. He used a plasma cutter. The coupling behind the panel was not the coupling shown on the map. It was a junction bypass, an off-spec reroute that someone had installed to work around a failed valve. The bypass was carrying full system pressure. When Sorval cut through the panel, his plasma cutter nicked the bypass line. The line ruptured. 700 liters of pressurized water blew through the maintenance panel in 4 seconds. Sorval was thrown against the opposite bulkhead. 2 other technicians were drenched. The corridor flooded to ankle depth before emergency shut-off valves upstream closed the feed. Sorval was not seriously injured, bruised ribs, a cut above his eye, and the particular humiliation of being knocked off his feet by a pipe he did not know existed. But the rupture had consequences that went beyond the flood. The emergency shutoff had closed the feed to the Deck 7 portside residential corridor. 1,800 residents lost water pressure. Showers stopped working. Toilets stopped cycling. The drinking water dispensers on the corridor's common level went dry. Director Shale received 1,400 complaint filings within 90 minutes. Corin heard about the rupture through the maintenance channel. He was on Deck 14 at the time, inspecting the junctions in his own sector, the lower deck distribution grid that he had been maintaining for 9 years. He already knew the condition of every pipe, every coupling, every seal in his territory. He knew which ones wept. He knew which ones had been reinforced. He knew which ones were original installation and which ones had been replaced. He knew all of this because he had spent 9 years crawling through them, touching them, listening to them, tightening them with his hand-forged wrench 1/4 turn at a time. He had finished his sector's inspection in 4 hours, 43 junctions. 11 needed minor work, 2 needed seal replacements. 1, the weeping coupling at junction 49, needed a full housing swap, which he had been requesting for 3 years. He filed his report. Then he sat on the floor of the Deck 14 utility corridor and waited for someone to read it. Nobody did. They were too busy dealing with the flood on Deck 7. At hour 12, The second cascade failure hit. The emergency shutoff that had stopped the Deck 7 rupture had rerouted water pressure through the secondary distribution loop. The secondary loop was designed for exactly this purpose, a backup path that could carry full system load if the primary feed was interrupted. But the secondary loop on Decks 6 through 8 had not been physically inspected in at least 5 years. The rerouted pressure, slightly higher than the loop's normal operating load, found a corroded elbow joint on Deck 6 that had been silently thinning for years. The joint did not rupture. It began to seep, a thin, steady stream of treated water running down the inside of a bulkhead and pooling behind a cargo storage module that nobody had moved since the last station reconfiguration. The seep was slow enough that no automated alarm triggered. It was fast enough that, over the course of 6 hours, it deposited approximately 300 liters of water into the crawlspace beneath the Deck 6 power distribution relay. At hour 18, the water reached the relay. Power distribution relays are, by design, water-resistant. They are not waterproof. There is a difference. The relay's housing was rated for incidental splash exposure, a spilled container, a burst cooling line, the kind of brief water contact that might occur during maintenance. It was not rated for 6 hours of continuous submersion. The relay shorted. Deck 6 lost primary power. Emergency lighting activated. The environmental system switched to backup mode, and the gravity generators on the portside section of Deck 6 experienced a 4-second interruption that sent everything not bolted down: furniture, equipment, cargo containers, people floating briefly before the backup caught and dropped them back to the deck. 3 Vaelith civilians were treated for minor injuries. 1 child broke her wrist. At hour 22, the third cascade hit. The gravity interruption on Deck 6 had jarred loose a mounting bracket on one of the automated valve assemblies in the ceiling of the portside corridor. The bracket held a trunkline shutoff valve, a heavy, cast alloy component designed to isolate sections of the distribution network in an emergency. The bracket had been installed during the original construction. It had never been physically inspected. The bolt holes had been drilled slightly oversize, and the bracket had been held in place by friction and the steady downward pull of the gravity generators for the station's entire operational lifespan. When the gravity flickered, the bracket shifted 3 millimeters. The valve did not fall, the feed lines held it, but the shift created a gap between the valve body and its seat gasket. Not a large gap, approximately the width of a human hair, but a gap in a pressurized trunk line is not measured by width. It is measured by what comes through it. What came through it was a fine mist of pressurized system water, spraying at a 45-degree angle into the ceiling cavity above Deck 6's main residential corridor. The mist coated the interior surface of the ceiling panels, condensed, and began dripping onto the corridor floor in a steady rain that no sensor registered because the valve's flow rate was unchanged. The gap was too small to affect pressure readings. Residents of the Deck 6 corridor woke to water falling from their ceiling. The station's emergency response team, already stretched thin between the Deck 7 flooding cleanup and the power relay repair, dispatched 2 technicians to trace the source. They spent 4 hours looking for a pipe breach inside the walls. The breach was not in the walls. It was in the ceiling, in a valve bracket that was not on the maintenance checklist because bracket inspection fell outside the scope of both the Water Systems Division and the Structural Integrity Division. It belonged to nobody. It had always belonged to nobody. By the time they found it, 6 residential compartments had sustained water damage. Personal belongings were ruined. A Vaelith family with 2 children had to be relocated to temporary quarters on Deck 9. The mother filed a formal grievance with Director Shale's office. It was the 4011th complaint filing in 72 hours. The maintenance channel was now carrying traffic at a volume that Corin had never seen in 9 years on the station. Priority flags overlapped. Repair orders contradicted each other. 2 separate teams had been dispatched to the same junction on Deck 8, while 3 critical junctions on Deck 5 had no one assigned at all. The engineering division's coordination had collapsed into a reactive scramble, each new failure pulling resources from the team trying to prevent the next one. Corin listened to the channel from his utility corridor on Deck 14 and recognized the sound. He had heard it before, on other stations in other years. It was the sound of an organization that had built its entire understanding of infrastructure on the assumption that everything worked until it didn't, and that when it didn't, you could fix the one thing that broke and move on. That assumption held when failures were isolated. When failures cascaded, it fell apart, because the organization had no one who understood the system as a whole who could see that the Deck 7 rupture, the Deck 6 relay short, and the Deck 6 bracket failure were not 3 separate problems but one problem with 3 symptoms, and that the underlying cause was not any single corroded joint or misaligned bracket, but the accumulated cost of years of not touching the infrastructure with human hands. Director Shale called another emergency session. This time she invited Dreschen, the senior structural engineer, the senior power engineer, and Inspector Sahune himself. The session lasted 2 hours. Corin listened to the portions that leaked onto the maintenance channel. Sahune's voice was colder now. "You have a cascading infrastructure failure driven by water system neglect," he said. "A single point of failure on Deck 7 has now propagated to the secondary distribution loop and compromised power distribution on Deck 6. Your engineering team has inspected approximately 6% of the water network in 18 hours. At this rate, you will not complete the inspection within the 72-hour window. You will not complete it within 144 hours. I have seen enough to issue a preliminary failure rating." Director Shale's voice was tight. "Inspector, we are allocating every available resource." "You are allocating engineers who are not plumbers to do a plumber's job," Sahune said. "They are using diagnostic instruments designed for laboratory analysis, not field inspection. They are working from system maps that do not match the physical infrastructure, and they do not know the network well enough to distinguish between a condensation artifact and a Category 2 seal failure, which is exactly the error that brought us to this point." There was a silence. "Do you have anyone on the station," Sahune asked, "who actually knows these pipes?" Risha came to find Corin at hour 20. He was in the crawlspace beneath Deck 12, replacing a gasket. She crouched at the access hatch and looked in at him, a pair of human legs sticking out from beneath a cluster of conduit housings, the sound of a wrench tightening something, the faint smell of sealant compound. "They need you in the operations theater," she said. Corin did not stop working. "I'm not credentialed to be in the operations theater." "The inspector asked for you." The wrench stopped. A pause, then he asked for me by name. "He asked for the person who maintains the lower deck water systems." Director Shale asked Dreschen who that was. Dreschen said he didn't know, so I told them. Corin was quiet for a moment. Then he slid out of the crawlspace, wiped his hands on his coveralls, and picked up his wrench. "Lead the way," he said. The Central Operations Theater was a curved amphitheater near the top of the station's administrative ring. Corin had never been inside it. The room was built for presentations, tiered seating, holographic displays, ambient lighting tuned to the cool blue-white palette that the Vaelith preferred for formal spaces. It smelled like recycled air and floor polish. Every surface was clean in the way that surfaces are clean when the people who clean them are never seen. He walked in wearing gray coveralls with sealant compound on the sleeves, a pipe wrench in his belt, and work boots that left faint dark prints on the polished floor. Every head in the room turned. Director Shale stood at the central podium. Dreschen stood to her left, holding his datapad like a shield. 3 junior engineers flanked them. Inspector Sahune sat in the front row of the tiered seating, one long leg crossed over the other, his stylus resting against his lower lip. Shale looked at Corin the way someone looks at furniture that has been moved to the wrong room. You are the contracted water systems maintenance worker. Corin Halloway, human plumber. Your credentials. Terran Guild of Pipefitters Master Class, 26 years active, 9 years on this station. Dression shifted. Terran credentials are not recognized by the Directorate. No, Corin said, they're not. Sahune leaned forward. Mr. Halloway, I have reviewed the maintenance logs for the lower deck distribution grid. Your sector decks 12 through 18 shows an anomalous pattern. In 9 years, your section has recorded 0 catastrophic failures, 0 unscheduled shutdowns, and 0 water quality deviations. Yes. The rest of the station has recorded 17 catastrophic failures, 43 unscheduled shutdowns, and 11 water quality deviations in the same period. Yes. How? Corin looked at the room full of credentialed engineers and high-ranking administrators. He shifted the wrench in his belt. I fix things before they break. Sahune waited. Look, Corin said, and he was not performing, not posturing. He was talking the way a man talks when he has spent 9 years doing a thing that nobody understood, and someone has finally asked him about it. Water doesn't care about your credentials, doesn't care about your sensors, doesn't care about your automated monitoring systems. Water goes where it wants to go. It finds the weak point. It finds the fatigue. It finds the place where the metal is thin or the seal is old or the weld was done on a Friday by someone who was thinking about lunch. And it gets in, not fast, slow, 1 molecule at a time. And by the time your sensor reads a pressure drop, the damage has already been done for months. He pulled his wrench from his belt and held it up, not theatrically, the way a man holds a tool he has used 10,000 times. This is a wrench. It doesn't have a sensor suite. It doesn't have a data link. What it has is me on the other end of it, touching every pipe in my sector with my hands every 72 hours. I feel the vibration. I listen to the flow. I check the temperature of the housing with my palm. I look at the color of the condensation. And when something is wrong, when a seal is starting to go, when a coupling is getting tired, when a joint is corroding from the inside, I know. Not because a dashboard told me, because I was there, because I put my hands on it. He set the wrench down on the podium's edge. The clang of heavy metal on polished composite was the loudest sound in the room. I filed 11 deviation reports in the last 8 months, weeping seals, corroded housings, a hairline fracture on deck 7 that I found by listening to the wall. I filed every one through the standard maintenance channel. None of them were acknowledged. None of them were read. The deck 7 fracture. That's 3 meters from the junction bypass that ruptured yesterday. If someone had read my report 6 months ago, you could have scheduled a repair during a planned maintenance window. Instead, a technician who didn't know the bypass existed put a plasma cutter through it. He looked at Dression, not with hostility, with the flat, weary patience of a man who has seen this particular failure many times. Your system maps are wrong. They haven't been updated since the last station reconfiguration. There are 47 off-spec reroutes in the mid-level grid that don't appear on any map. I know where they are because I found them, by crawling through the pipes, on my hands and knees, with a flashlight and this wrench. The room was silent. Sahune uncrossed his legs. Mr. Halloway, can you complete the inspection? Not the way your engineers are doing it. Not with digital calipers and ultrasonic gauges and portable pressure rigs that need calibration between every reading. That's laboratory work. This is field work. The pipes don't need to be measured. They need to be touched. How long? Give me access to the full network, including the sections behind sealed bulkheads. Give me 2 of your technicians who are willing to crawl and listen. And give me the authority to shut down individual feeds without going through the director's office for approval. Shale stiffened. That authority rests with senior engineering. With respect, Director, Senior Engineering is why we're standing here. The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms. Not hostile, not confrontational. The silence of people recalculating assumptions that they had held for so long they had forgotten they were assumptions. Sahune turned to Shale. Granted. Shale looked at Sahune. She looked at Dreschen. She looked at the plumber in gray coveralls standing at the podium where no plumber had ever stood. Granted, she said. Corin started at the bottom of the network and worked up. This was the opposite of what the engineering team had done. They had started at the top, the main reservoir, the primary trunk, because that was where the system maps were most accurate, where the infrastructure was newest, where the readings were cleanest. It was the engineering approach. Start with the known, work toward the unknown. Corin started with the unknown, the oldest pipes, the deepest crawl spaces, the sections that nobody had entered since the station was built. He started there because that was where the failures lived, not the dramatic failures, not the ruptures and the floods and the power shorts, the quiet failures, the weeping seals, the thinning walls, the corroded joints that were one thermal cycle away from giving out, the failures that hadn't happened yet. Risha volunteered to be one of his 2 technicians. The second was a young Vaelith named Kelvor, who had been on the station for less than a year and who, alone among the junior technicians, had the particular virtue of knowing that he did not know things. Corin taught them as they went. Put your hand on the pipe. Feel that vibration. That's normal. That's the pump harmonic. Now feel this one. He moved Risha's hand 3 meters down the same pipe. Feel the difference, that flutter. That's a seal that's starting to fatigue. It's not leaking yet. It won't leak for another month. But when it goes, it'll take out this whole feed section. He marked the location. Risha logged it. They moved on. Listen, put your ear right here. Hear that hiss? That's air in the line. Air in a closed water system means a breach somewhere upstream. Probably a gasket that's lost compression. It's letting atmosphere in. The water's still flowing, the pressure's still reading normal, but the air is degrading the biological filter layer in the recycling loop. In 6 months, your recycled water starts tasting like metal. In a year, it's carrying microbiological contaminants that your treatment process wasn't designed to handle. He found the gasket. He replaced it. 20 minutes. The engineering team's procedure for the same repair: diagnose with ultrasonic gauge, requisition replacement part through the supply chain, schedule installation during a maintenance window, file pre-work and post-work documentation, would have taken 11 days. Kelvor watched the repair with an expression that Corin had seen many times on the faces of young technicians encountering hands-on work for the first time. Not confusion, not contempt. Something closer to vertigo, the disorientation of realizing that the world is built differently than the classroom described it. How did you know it was a gasket? Kelvor asked, without scanning. Because air in a closed system means a seal failure. The hiss was at a junction, not at a valve. Junctions don't have moving parts, their only seal points are gaskets and weld joints. The hiss was high-pitched, which means a thin gap, which means compression loss, not a crack. Compression loss at a junction is a gasket, every time. He paused. Then he said something he had never said to an engineer before, because no engineer had ever asked. Your instruments tell you what the readings are. My hands tell me what the pipes are doing. Those aren't the same thing. A reading is a number from one moment, one sensor, one location. What the pipe is doing is a story. It has a past and a direction and a destination. The corroded joint was corroding yesterday, and it will corrode more tomorrow. The tired gasket is a little more tired every pressure cycle. The readings can't tell you that. The readings just tell you the score right now. I need to know where the game is going. Risha wrote that down, verbatim. She would later include it in a training manual that Sorald Dreschen's replacement would adopt as required reading for every new technician assigned to the station. See this discoloration, this green ring around the coupling? That's mineral deposit from treated water. It shouldn't be on the outside of the pipe. It's here because this coupling was over-torqued during installation. The gasket was compressed past its rated limit. It's sealed fine. It's not leaking, but the overcompression created a microchannel in the gasket material that lets treated water wick up through the seal by capillary action. It's not a leak. It's a pathway. And in 4 or 5 years, that pathway becomes a leak. He loosened the coupling, replaced the gasket, retorqued it to spec, by hand. With his wrench, he could feel the right tension in his forearm, in his wrist, in the way the wrench stopped moving when the gasket was seated correctly. 26 years of muscle memory encoded in the tendons of his hands. They worked through the night. By hour 30, they had inspected the entire lower third of the network decks 10 through 18. 208 junctions. 41 needed work. 14 of those were urgent. Corin had fixed 6 of the urgent ones on the spot, using materials from his personal supply cache, a collection of replacement gaskets, seal kits, reinforcement sleeves, sealant compound, and hand tools that he kept in a storage locker on deck 14 that was not technically assigned to him. His reports went directly to Sahune. Not through the maintenance channel, not through Dreschen-Vuo's engineering dashboard, directly to the inspector's personal datapad. Sahune had arranged this after the first 3 hours, when he realized that the reports Corin was generating were the first accurate assessment of the station's water infrastructure that had ever been produced. Dreschen-Vuo watched this happen and said nothing. He had tried at the beginning to reassert his authority. He had pointed out that Corin's inspection methodology was non-standard, that his reports did not follow the Directorate's documentation format, that his repairs were being made without engineering authorization, that his credentials were Terran, not Directorate. Sahune had listened. Then he had said, "Chief Engineer Vuo, your standard methodology missed a Category 2 seal failure at the base of Filtration Column 4. Your documentation format logged 0 deviation reports, while your station's contracted plumber filed 11 that your office never read. Your engineering authorization process requires approval from a chain of command that does not know the difference between condensation and a leak. And your Directorate credentials have produced a station that is, at this moment, in the early stages of a cascading water system failure that threatens the safety of 40,000 people." He had paused. Mr. Halloway's credentials have produced a section of this station that has not experienced a single failure in 9 years. Dreschen did not raise the subject again. At hour 42, Corin found the real problem. He was in the subdeck crawlspace beneath the water treatment facility, the same cathedral-sized chamber where Sahune had found the puddle at the base of Column 4. The crawlspace was not on the system maps. It was not supposed to exist. It had been created during the station's original construction as a service access for the treatment facility's foundation infrastructure. And then it had been sealed off during the first reconfiguration, because the new environmental control routing had been run through the same space, and someone had decided it was easier to close the hatch and forget about it than to work around the new conduits. Corin had known about the crawlspace for 7 years. He had found the sealed hatch during one of his early explorations of the station's lower infrastructure, pried it open with a crowbar, and climbed down into a space that no one had entered in decades. He had gone back periodically to check the foundation pipes that ran through it, the pipes that fed the treatment facility's 6 filtration columns from below. Now he was back. Risha and Kethais were with him. The crawlspace was tight, dark, and smelled like old metal and biological residue. Corin moved through it on his belly, his flashlight clamped between his teeth, his wrench in his right hand. He reached the foundation manifold, the central distribution point, where the main water trunk split into 6 feeder lines, 1 for each filtration column. He put his hand on the manifold housing, and he felt it. Not a vibration, not a flutter, a pulse, A rhythmic, slow, steady pulse in the metal that should not have been there. The manifold was a passive junction. It had no moving parts, no valves, no pumps. It should have transmitted the steady flow pressure of the main trunk. Instead, it was pulsing. Corin pressed his ear to the housing. He listened. The sound was wrong, not the clean, continuous rush of water moving through a pipe. A stuttered rhythm, push, pause, like a heartbeat. He moved his hands over the manifold's surface, methodically, sector by sector. His fingers found it near the bottom curve, on the side facing the station's outer hull. A section of housing that was warmer than the surrounding metal. Not by much, a few degrees, maybe, but enough to feel. He pulled a small mirror from his tool kit, angled it beneath the manifold, and shone his flashlight onto the reflection. The underside of the housing showed a network of hairline fractures radiating from a central point, a weld joint where the manifold connected to the main trunk. The fractures were tiny, invisible to the naked eye unless you knew what you were looking for, but they were there, and they were wet. The manifold was failing. Not leaking, not yet, but the fractures were propagating. The pulsing he had felt was the manifold flexing microscopically at each pressure cycle, expanding and contracting at the fracture point, driving the cracks a fraction of a millimeter deeper with every beat. The warmth was friction heat, from the metal moving against itself at the fracture boundaries. Corin lay on his belly in the dark and did the calculation in his head. Propagation rate, given the fracture pattern and the pressure cycling frequency. Time to critical failure, the point where the cracks intersected and the manifold housing lost structural integrity. 72 hours, maybe less. If the manifold failed, the main water trunk would lose pressure simultaneously across all 6 filtration column feeds. The treatment facility would shut down. The station's recycled water supply would stop. 40,000 people would be without water within 6 hours. And no sensor anywhere on the station would see it coming, because the manifold was in a crawl space that wasn't on the maps, beneath a hatch that had been sealed shut, in a space that, as far as the Vaelith Directorate was concerned, did not exist. Corin pulled himself out of the crawl space, walked to the nearest communication panel, and called Inspector Sahune directly. "I found it," he said. The repair took 14 hours. It was not a simple repair. The manifold could not be replaced. It was a structural component of the treatment facility's foundation, and removing it would require shutting down the entire water system and evacuating the decks above. What it could was be stabilized. The fractures could be arrested. The housing could be reinforced. The weld joint could be remade. But it had to be done by hand, in the crawl space, on his belly, with a portable welding rig, a reinforcement sleeve cut to spec from scrap plating, sealant compound, and his wrench. Corin did it himself, not because he did not trust Risha and Kethais, he did, but this repair required 26 years of knowing how metal behaved under stress, how to lay a weld bead at exactly the right angle to arrest a propagating fracture, how to torque a reinforcement sleeve so that it compressed the housing without creating new stress concentrations, how to feel, through the handle of his wrench, the moment when the fitting was tight enough and not one fraction of a turn more. He worked in the dark by flashlight while the manifold pulsed beneath his hands. The first step was arresting the fracture propagation. He heated the housing around each fracture tip with a focused thermal probe, not welding, not yet, just heating the metal enough to expand it microscopically and blunt the leading edge of each crack. It was a technique he had learned from a Terran shipyard welder named Oda 30 years ago, on a colony world where replacement parts took 6 months to arrive, and you learned to make what you had last. Oda had called it putting the crack to sleep. You heated the tip until the metal softened just enough to round the sharp leading edge, and the fracture stopped propagating, because the stress concentration at the tip dropped below the threshold needed to drive it forward. He worked each fracture tip individually. There were 19 of them. Each one took between 4 and 8 minutes, depending on the metal thickness and the angle he could achieve in the crawl space. He could not rush it. Heating too fast would change the metal's crystalline structure and create a new weak point. Heating too slowly would not blunt the tip sufficiently. The right temperature was something he felt through the thermal probe's handle, a subtle chain in the resistance of the metal against the probe tip that told him the surface layer had softened. No instrument measured this. No textbook described it. It was knowledge that lived in his hands and nowhere else. The second step was the reinforcement sleeve. He had cut it from scrap hull plating in the station's machine shop, a curved section of high-grade alloy, shaped to conform to the manifold's curvature, with bolt holes drilled at precise intervals to distribute the clamping force evenly. He had calculated the bolt spacing by feel, pressing his palm against the manifold and mapping the fracture pattern by touch, then transferring those measurements to the sleeve with a grease pencil. The third step was the weld. The sleeve had to be welded to the manifold housing along its edges, creating a continuous bond that would take the structural load off the fractured section and transfer it to the sleeve. But the weld could not be too hot. Excess heat would expand the fractures he had just arrested, and it could not be too cold, or the bond would be brittle and fail under the next thermal cycle. Risha and Kethais handed him tools. They held the flashlight when his own grew dim. They kept the communication channel open to Sahune, who was monitoring from the operations theater with a growing expression that Risha could not quite name, something between professional admiration and the particular distress of a man who was realizing how close he had come to signing off on a station that was about to catastrophically fail. At hour 56 of the 72-hour window, Corin tightened the last bolt on the reinforcement sleeve, pressed his palm flat against the manifold housing, and held his breath. The pulse was gone. The metal was still, warm from the welding but still. The pressure was even. The fractures were arrested, held in compression by the sleeve, sealed by compound, reinforced by a weld bead that followed the fracture lines like a surgeon following a suture path. He let out his breath. Then he lay there for a minute in the dark in the crawlspace, because his arms were shaking and his back hurt, and he was 53 years old and he had been working for 36 hours straight. Then he pulled himself out, walked to the communication panel and said, "It's done." The final inspection report was filed by Kelvor Sahune 48 hours after the manifold repair. The report was 73 pages long. It documented every deficiency found during the review, every cascade failure, every corroded joint and weeping seal and off-spec reroute in the station's water network. It was, by Sahune's own admission, the most comprehensive infrastructure assessment he had conducted in 20 years of service. The summary page contained 2 ratings. The first was for the station's Water Systems Engineering Division, under the leadership of Chief Engineer Dreshenvuo. Category 3 deficiency, immediate remediation required. This was one step above a shutdown order. It meant Dreshen's entire methodology, the reliance on automated monitoring, the unread maintenance reports, the system maps that did not match reality, the beautiful data that had nothing to do with what was actually happening inside the pipes, was officially, formally, catastrophically inadequate. The second rating was for the physical infrastructure of the station's lower-deck water distribution grid, decks 12 through 18, maintained by contracted worker Corin Halloway, full compliance exemplary. This was the highest rating the Directorate could issue. It had not been issued to any section of any orbital platform in Sahune's career. The report's final paragraph was quoted on the station's internal news feed. Director Shale authorized it personally, which was itself remarkable, because it meant a Vaelith director was allowing a human plumber's words to be broadcast on a Vaelith station. The paragraph read, "The structural integrity of Vaelith's water infrastructure was maintained not by the engineering division's automated monitoring systems, not by the credentialed staff's diagnostic instruments, and not by the Directorate's standard maintenance protocols." It was maintained by a single contracted worker with a hand-forged pipe wrench and 26 years of practice craft, who inspected 14,000 junctions by touch, diagnosed failures by sound, and prevented a catastrophic manifold collapse that no sensor on this station would have detected. The Directorate's credentialing system does not recognize Terran Guild certifications. This inspector recommends that the Directorate reconsider what it recognizes. Corin did not attend the report's formal reading. He was not invited, and he did not expect to be. He was in the crawlspace beneath Deck 12, replacing a gasket. But something changed after that. The first change was small. His deviation reports started getting responses. Not immediately, the bureaucratic apparatus of a Vaelith orbital platform did not pivot overnight. But within a week, the maintenance channel began routing his flagged items to a new queue, one that was monitored directly by Sahune's Bureau of Structural Integrity rather than by the station's engineering division. His reports were read. His recommendations were acted upon. Repair materials he had been requesting for years appeared in his storage locker without explanation. The second change was larger. Dreschen Vuel was reassigned. Not fired, the Vaelith Directorate did not fire credentialed engineers, but he was moved to a research posting on a groundside facility where his talent for data analysis and publication could be exercised without the complication of actual pipes. His replacement was a younger Vaelith engineer named Saral, who arrived on the station, read Sahune's report, and on her first day walked to Deck 14 and asked Corin Halloway if he would show her the crawlspaces. He handed her a flashlight and his spare wrench. "Watch your head," he said, "and don't touch the manifold housing until I show you how it sounds when it's happy." The third change was the one that mattered most. Director Shale authorized a new position on the station's labor manifest. It was not an engineering position. It was not an administrative position. It was a new category entirely, one that had never existed in the Vaelith Directorate's organizational structure: Master Craftsman, Water Systems. The position carried the same access privileges as a senior engineer, but required no Directorate credentials. Its qualifications were defined not by academic certification, but by demonstrated craft years of hands-on practice, physical knowledge of the infrastructure, and the ability to diagnose system conditions by touch, sound, and observation. The first person appointed to the position was a 53-year-old human plumber with a hand-forged wrench and calluses thick enough to grip a hot pipe. Corin received the notification while he was eating a cold sandwich in a utility closet on Deck 11, which was where he ate most of his meals. He read it on his datapad. He read it again. Then he set the datapad down, finished his sandwich, picked up his wrench, and went back to work. Risha found him 20 minutes later, inspecting a coupling on Deck 13. "Did you see?" she asked. "I saw. They created a new category. For you, the first master craftsman in Directorate history." Corin tightened the coupling a quarter turn, tested it, loosened it an eighth turn, tested it again. His hands moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this exact motion so many times that it had become as automatic as breathing. "Doesn't change the job," he said. Risha watched him work. She had been watching him work for weeks now, through the cascade failures, through the frantic inspections, through the 14-hour manifold repair in the dark. She had watched him teach her and Kethais how to listen to pipes, how to feel for fatigue, how to read the language of metal under stress. She had watched him stand in the operations theater in front of the director and the inspector and the entire senior engineering staff and explain, without embarrassment and without pride, that the most sophisticated diagnostic tool on the station was his hands. "Corin," she said, "you saved the station." He set his wrench on the pipe and straightened up. His back ached. His knees ached. His hands ached. He was 53 years old and he had been crawling through pipes since before Risha was born, and the pipes still needed him, and tomorrow he would crawl through them again. "No," he said, "I maintained it, there's a difference." He picked up his wrench. He walked to the next junction, and behind him, somewhere in the administrative ring far above, a new category was being written into the Directorate's organizational charter, a category that said, for the first time in the history of an empire that valued credentials above all things, that mastery could come from the hands as well as from the academy. The pipes didn't know, the pipes didn't care. They just needed someone who would show up, every shift, every day, and put their hands on the metal and listen. Corin Halloway showed up. He had always shown up. And that, the inspector wrote in his final note, the one that went not to the Bureau, but to the Directorate Council itself, hand-delivered, sealed, stamped with his personal authority, was worth more than every credential the Directorate had ever issued. The note was 9 words long. "This man's hands know things your instruments cannot." It was enough.